The government has used emergency powers under the Information Technology Rules of 2021 to block a controversial BBC documentary on Prime Minister Modi. On this special broadcast, we'll have guests from both India and the United Kingdom to understand and decode the storm. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Even as India takes charge of the G20 presidency, and the Prime Minister has been described by UK lawmaker Karan Bilamoria as one of the most powerful men on the planet, a BBC two-part documentary has been blocked by the government here. The government has dismissed the film as malicious propaganda, one that presumes itself to be above India's Supreme Court. In fact, the government has specifically linked this documentary to what the Foreign Ministry spokesperson called a colonial mindset. The documentary has created ripples in the United Kingdom at a time when the BBC is caught up in a storm of its own. Its chairman has been accused of a conflict of interest of being appointed after he helped secure a personal loan for the now ousted Prime Minister of UK, Boris Johnson. There's a lot to unpack here. The opposition in India, of course, is contesting the government decision to block the documentary and calling it unacceptable censorship. The government, however, is arguing that emergency powers under the IT rules have been invoked because this is a challenge to India's sovereignty. It is also potentially a film that can create public disorder and also create fiction between communities. Let's introduce our very distinguished panel of guests on the program today. Sanjay Jha. Sanjay Jha is a critic of this government. He's been criticizing the blocking of this documentary. We'll try and understand why in a few moments from now. We're also very pleased to have with us Lord Karan Bilamoria, an extremely successful British Indian story. He's the founder of Cobra Beer, but also the UK lawmaker who called the Prime Minister one of the most powerful people on the planet. Good to see you, Karan. Also joining us from the United Kingdom today is Bharat Ramanan. I remember when the documentary reached out, Bharat reached out to me and said, you know what, as a British Asian, I've had enough. This documentary is too stereotypical. We'll find out why he was so incensed. And finally, the ultimate guru on brand and image consultancy who understands political communication like nobody else, our very favorite Dilip Cherian. It's good to see all of you gentlemen. And before we get started, I just want to play out for anybody who may have missed it, how India's foreign ministry has responded, explaining why the government took the decision to block the airing of this film, this documentary on the Prime Minister in India.
Do note that this has not been screened in India. So I am only going to comment on the context of what I have heard about or have my colleagues have seen. Let me just make it very clear. We think this is a propaganda piece designed to push a particular discredited narrative. The bias, a lack of objectivity, and frankly, a continuing colonial mindset is blatantly visible. If anything, this film or documentary is a reflection on the agency and individuals that are peddling this narrative again. It makes us wonder whether about the purpose of this exercise and the agenda behind it. And frankly, we do not wish to dignify such efforts.
So that's the foreign ministry. But before I get Lord Karan Bilamoria to in fact open with his comments, I want to play out just a short excerpt from his speech where he's trying to contextualize both the importance of India and the Prime Minister to his fellow lawmakers. Listen in.
Wants to do business with India. We need to go the extra mile. And I conclude with this. Narendra Modi, as a boy, sold tea at his father's tea stall at a railway station in Gujarat. Today, Narendra Modi is one of the most powerful people on this planet as Prime Minister of India. Today, India has the presidency of the G20. Today, India has a vision in the next 25 years to be the second largest economy in the world with a GDP of $32 billion. The Indian Express has left the station. It is now the fastest train in the world, the fastest growing major economy in the world. The UK must be the closest and trusted friend or partner of India in the decades ahead.
All right, strong words there. Let me get started with you, Lord Karan Bilamoria. You described the Prime Minister as someone who literally rose from very, very humble backgrounds to become what you call one of the most powerful people in, on the planet. This BBC documentary, the second part of which is still to be aired, has created a storm both here and in the United Kingdom. How do you see the entire debate around it?
I first met Narendra Modi when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, when the BJP-led government at that time, 2 decades ago, started the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas event, an initiative. It was such a wonderful initiative. And he used to come to them almost every time. And that's when I first met him. And of course, since then, I've been privileged to meet him while he's been Prime Minister. And I think that there's no question about it. This is a very, very important time in history for the UK and India, because we are in the midst of negotiating a free trade agreement. Since leaving the European Union, Britain now has the ability to negotiate our own free trade agreements. Otherwise, it was through the European Union. And we have already signed agreements with Australia and New Zealand. And India is the big, big agreement that we've been working on. There have been 6 different phases we've gone through, about to start the 7th. Negotiations are on in full swing. And we know very, very clearly from the UK's point of view, India has overtaken the UK now as the 5th largest economy in the world. The UK is the 6th largest economy in the world. And look at the difference. I mean, the UK makes up less than 1% of the world's population. And India, with 1.4 billion, is soon to be the largest populated country in the world. So giant economies now as friends going to be working together in the future. This is a very crucial time for us when negotiating free trade agreement, that we have the utmost trust, respect in each other going forward. And the BBC is an institution. I spoke in debates about the BBC last year, because last year was the centenary of the BBC. And let's be frank, the BBC over the decades has always had a reputation around the world as being the most famous broadcasting corporation in the world, one that is respected for its trust in being impartial. People trust what the BBC say, particularly in times of crisis. And we've seen this time and again over many, many decades. So this is a situation where people are understandably very upset. And I think we've got to put in the context of the times we're in now and look forward. And also with India, with the presidency of the G20, I mean, this is the top table of the world. And India is right up there. And the whole world is looking to India. This is a time for the UK and India to be the best of friends going forward.
Do you think, given the reputation or the recall value, as you said, Lord Billy of the BBC around the world, India's blocking of the documentary, how is that going down in the United Kingdom?
It is the India's blocking of, we've heard what the spokesperson said from the foreign ministry. And let's be clear, this has not been shown in India. Because the BBC is watched by 500 million people every week, watched and listened to. And India is the highest in all the countries of the listeners and viewers of the BBC. But this program was not BBC. It's shown on BBC Two here. What's shown in India is a BBC World Service. So to my knowledge, it has not been broadcast in India at all.
That is correct. And that's something the foreign ministry spokesperson also emphasized. But of course, since then, Dilip Cherian, we've had opposition leaders. It's become, like everything else in India, the subject of domestic political football. And we've had opposition leaders, for example, like Mahua Moitra, sharing a link to tweets that have been subsequently blocked on Twitter. And of course, there is a kind of political rebellion brewing. That said, it is unlikely to hurt the stock, if one were to talk politically, of the Prime Minister. In fact, 2002 is something that the opposition barely mentions even in domestic political campaigns anymore. Secondly, of course, there is a colonial mindset that is being invoked again and again. There are people all day online have been saying, why doesn't the BBC do something on Winston Churchill? Then somebody else pulled out something that the BBC had done on Winston Churchill. What's getting Indians so agitated? Is it the asymmetry of power? As Karan said, this is a powerful nation now being judged, some would say, by an erstwhile colonial master. Is it the popularity of the Prime Minister? Or are Indians, those who are supporting the decision to block this film, being too thin-skinned?
There are 2 reasons, and I think you've touched on both of them. The first is the enormous popularity which the Prime Minister has, both in India and globally, and therefore they have a basis for action. The second is that don't forget that this Prime Minister has probably the most ardent, most consistent, and most vocal set of digital warriors in play, in position, and who are able to contend with things like this in a real-time basis. We are talking of a new world here. We're talking of a world where, as you have referred to, the new internet laws are needed because we were formerly governed by archaic laws, archaic practices, and archaic political communications. So all of this needs to be put in context when you see the huge storm that this has raised, and it has therefore been drawn to everybody's attention. But as far as the BBC goes, please understand that the BBC also did an enormously tough documentary on the 1984 riots. So the BBC has a tradition of doing, uh, you know, producing documentaries, films, whatever they may be called. And from time to time, they do raise hackles across the world for two reasons. One, they're seen a lot and trusted. And two, because very often they, and always in good journalistic practice, they ensure that they give a chance to the other side to be heard. And I think that that's come through quite clearly, that the Indian government does not consider this worth either having been willing to participate officially in or deny it officially. And I think in many senses, in today's world of communications, the problem is that any BBC documentary goes to the top of any Google search.
Yeah, I think those are important points that you're making there, and also talking about the new age of digital politics, at which the BJP has, at least in the Indian context, been at the top of the race. Now, Sanjay, you have been a critic of the decision for the government's decision to block this documentary, to invoke, in fact, emergency powers under the IT rules of 2021. Uh, some might say we argue at home, but we unite when it comes to an external entity, and that you're not doing that. You would say what?
Barkha, I only unite for the sake of the people of this country and for justice. I don't believe a free trade agreement or a GDP or FDI or stock markets or joint ventures or foreign collaborations is the way to define diplomatic relationships. I think eventually it's all about humanity. And let me just kind of tell you why I disagree with both my panelists who spoke earlier. Why did the government not subject itself to whatever scrutiny the BBC had? We are talking about democracies here, right? You have Mr. Modi's government talking about being a mother of democracy. You have a political party in power that I think correctly questions the role of the Congress in the 1984 riots. And by the same logic, when you are in politics and you're a public figure, you got to subject yourself to a democratic dialogue. I mean, the truth be said, you have a Swapan Dasgupta, who, by the way, has been a member of parliament from the BJP, who has been quoted extensively on that program. So I really don't know exactly why the government stonewalled its own presence.
Let
Let me
me
give you
let
an
me
example.
let me read out to you what the law minister.
No, just a minute. Let me finish my initial point, and then I'm willing to
Sure,
take your questions.
sure.
You have a Joe Biden, who's the current president of the United States, whom the FBI is investigating as he is the president for documents at his home. Trump is being taken, frankly speaking, questioned by all the formidable institutions that America still has for all its faults, despite the fact that he may be a president again. I
Sure.
mean, end of day, Boris Johnson, that Lord Karan Bilimoria comes from a country where he lost his job for not wearing a mask. To say that just because Mr. Modi has become prime minister, he is beyond public scrutiny, I think it's preposterous. And Barkha, you have been there in the 2002 riots in Gujarat. You covered it on the ground. A lot of the stuff is already in the public domain. Critics of the documentary say, well, what's new? In that case, my question to them is, why are you so paranoid? Why are you so apprehensive that you're not letting
Okay, let
people?
me jump in. Let me jump in at this point only to make the point that in 2022, not 2002, but 2022, the Supreme Court upheld the special investigative team's clean chit to more than 60 people, including the Prime Minister, who was then Chief Minister. And I remember the Home Minister then saying that the Prime Minister has fought a 19-year-long battle. I'm just giving you what the Law Minister today now is saying. He's saying this documentary, presumes to cite British documents that somehow Indians are supposed to believe over their own Supreme Court. I'm just quoting Kiran Rijiju here. But before I kind of pick up your points and take them to Bharat, I want Lord Karan Bilamoria to come in just for a moment. Because Lord Bilamoria, the BBC right now, and we've got some UK headlines that reflect that, is caught up in a whirlpool of a storm of its own, right? You've got the BBC chairman being accused of a conflict of interest, having been given the job for helping Boris Johnson sort of secure a loan. We've had debates in the UK Parliament over how long the BBC should be subsidized by the British taxpayer. So it's a kind of irony. The BBC is facing all sorts of ethical questions while this storm is brewing in India. How do you see the current debate around the BBC and its future and where its credibility stands today? Can we unmute Lord Bilamoria? Give us a second, sir. Give us a second. Go ahead. I think you're muted. Maybe. Yeah, there you are. Go ahead.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, this broke just over the weekend. Literally, yesterday we had this revelation that supposedly the chairman of the BBC and the timing of his appointment, and then the links with a loan to Boris Johnson that was guaranteed to Boris Johnson, and on top of that, of course, the chairman of the BBC used to be our current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's. From what I understand, his boss at Goldman Sachs. So this is not new in that people known to people in government get appointed. You go back to Tony Blair's government, where various people who he worked with as a lawyer ended up being in government as well. The key thing is it should be investigated straight away. And from what I've heard, the chairman himself has said, please do look into it to see and make sure that everything was done properly when I was appointed as chair. So this is all very live. My understanding is he himself has said, please do look into it. I'm willing for you to do that straight away. And I think that's the right way to go with anything. Is there should be full transparency and a proper investigation straight away.
Okay. Bharat, when this documentary first hit the headlines, you sent me a text. And you said, we're all so tired of this. Now, you're not an unequivocal fan always of the Modi government. Why did you have the sort of ennui or the irritation that you did?
Thanks for having me, Barkha. I think, when I watched the documentary, and I watched it twice now, subjected myself to it twice now, I think the instinctive reaction was, what was the point of this? Now, if the documentary had put out some new information, as frankly, it only hinges on this particular restricted UK High Commission report that's cited extensively in the documentary. To my mind, as you view it, it almost seems like conjecture. So that was rightful indignance on my part in the first instance. The second is Jack Straw in an interview with Karan Thapar a few days ago. I don't know if you've seen it. He doesn't quite go the distance as he does in the documentary itself. He sort of maintains a healthy distance between the authors and the conclusions of that report and where he stood as Foreign Secretary of the time. Kamal Sibal has also come out and said that there was potentially a slanted report that was doing the rounds in Delhi at the time, and he'd also warned, or rather sent warnings to diplomats about not interfering in India's internal affairs. And lastly, what I find stunning is that the documentary seems to sort of assume that it has superiority over the wisdom and the judicial verdict that this particular case went through for 20 odd years, really. So the message you're giving me and young folk like myself in this country is that somehow, a documentary, which again has, a fair amount of conjecture, not a lot of evidence, predicated on the testimonies of a few chosen people, somehow, is above the law of the land of India's highest courts. And the government reaction, frankly, and I agree with Sanjay, I don't think is appropriate. I do understand the indignance, but I don't think it's particularly the best way to deal with a situation like this, because I think Indian public, if they were allowed
you don't like the documentary, you're irritated by it, but you don't agree with its censorship.
Absolutely. I think the Indian public is smart enough to figure out, what is what. And the documentary, frankly, does expose itself quite evidently as well.
So this is a very interesting question. I want to bring in Dilip here. There are two aspects to this. The documentary might create a yawn in some people, anger in others, and anger for different reasons. Some who agree with it, some who disagree with it, some who feel India has been stereotyped, some who may feel who's the United Kingdom to sit there in judgment, kind of look within, etc. But the censorship or the decision to block it, and extensive reasons have been cited: public disorder, questioning the sovereignty, undermining the Supreme Court. None of these have been officially placed, but the government has made it clear why it has invoked emergency powers. Some might argue, Dilip, this is counterproductive. It makes actually the documentary into a bigger deal than it might have been left to itself. Has the government scored a self goal, or has the government in fact shown, as Karan said, that this is a new India and take it or lump it?
This is, in a sense, Barkha, punishment signaling. Punishment signaling, I mean, by the government to say that, look, we will be extremely tough on unwarranted criticisms of us. So there is this mixture that if the MEA's statement is read carefully, of saying we will not tolerate any of these post-colonial jibes at us, and that too so far away from the time of any event that is reporting on. That's one. The second thing I think we need to understand is that, yes, the curiosity this raises because of the mere fact of it being censored is a likely magnet for people to want to see what's in it. And the fact that there is one more segment coming up will actually raise its viewership, which government could strongly have avoided. But the third point is that the real question that everybody is asking is, why this and why now? So why this documentary and why now? That question hangs in the air, and I think we should eventually have some answers.
What do you think, Dilip?
My sense is that the strong reaction is because of the fact that India is now in the limelight as never before. You've seen that at Davos. You've seen that with the ascendancy to the G20. So because India and this prime minister is so much in the limelight, therefore, any savvy broadcaster has probably realized this is a good time to air this. They probably had it ready earlier.
Well, we don't know. We don't know that, and the BBC has only said that they gave the government a right to respond, which the government did not engage with. Sanjay, does the documentary, is the documentary the cause you're championing, or is it sort of anti-censorship? And when it comes to free speech, unfortunately, no party in our country, including the Congress, the party you support, has a great record. There have been instances from the Congress years where there have been sort of books about the Gandhis that have been taken off the market. There have been similar instances in the BJP years. Structurally, we're just, unfortunately, I think, not at that point where all kinds of content can exist and be ignored, accepted, embraced, rejected, what have you, without it necessarily always being taken seriously. Sanjay, what is which principle are you standing up for here?
I don't negotiate in my principles, so let me be very straightforward with you. Let's skip the whataboutery here. I started by telling you upfront, and I'm a Congress party supporter. I think everybody knows that. And I started by telling you that I believe everyone has a right to question what happened in the 1984 riots. I come back to the fundamental point. This is a British Foreign Office report, number one. Number two, it's good to have two gentlemen who are living in the UK having an extraordinary faith in India's institutions. But since three of us happen to be from the local shores of India, we all know the current health of Indian mainstream media. We also know the kind of pressures the Indian judiciary is today, with the government openly challenging it for the basic structure of the constitution itself. So let us not pretend here, let us not pussyfoot around. You are dealing with a government with a clear authoritarian predisposition. Point number two, Mr. Modi is the Prime Minister.
Elected through completely free and fair means. You must underline that when you question the health of the other institutions.
Well, let me tell you, I do believe that democratically elected dictatorships are the rule of the day if you look at many countries around the world. But now let me just address the key point. Why is the government scared? You see, let's ask ourselves this question. Invoking an emergency power to stop that video gives you a message. It can't just be that there is an attempt to kind of destroy India's foreign diplomatic relationship and all the blah blah. I think there are fundamental issues that still remain unresolved. I believe, for example, if Britain were to apologize for what happened in Jallianwala Bagh many decades ago, it is a legitimate call that we people in India believe should happen. There are no closures when there has been a talk of a state sponsored genocide. It's the Supreme Court of India, not the BBC, by the way. It is not the Congress Party. It is the Supreme Court of India that said that Mr. Modi's government in Gujarat behaved like Nero.
Well,
What does that
well,
mean? No, what
can
does
I,
that mean? I'm asking this question to. I'm asking this
I'm just
question.
responding to you that
What was
you
the
can't quote
Supreme
the part of
Court?
the Supreme Court that you
No,
agree with
what
and
was
the
the
part that
Supreme?
you don't agree with, right?
No, no. I'm
You're
saying what
quoting
was the
you're quoting the bits of the Supreme Court that align with your politics and not the bits of the Supreme Court that don't align. You can't do that.
well, well,
You can't
well,
say the
well,
Supreme Court is not in good health when your politics disagrees with it, and the fine Supreme Court when your politics agrees with it. That's not fair, right?
absolutely. No, Barkha, no, I'll tell you why it is fair. Because all of us, including institutions, including you, including Karan, including Dilip, we are all not black and white, right? We live in a gray zone. Let's not try and be, very, shall we say, over optimistic.
I promise I'm not censoring you, Sanjay. That is your internet line. It has nothing to do with me curtailing your free speech. I'm sure you'll reconnect and we'll let you complete that point. Bharat, do you want to just jump in? It's time to actually take final comments. Bharat, do you want to kind of address a little bit of the space, the gray zone that actually Sanjay talks about that you occupy between finding the documentary offensive and not agreeing with what the government has done?
Sure, Barkha. I think, look, as I mentioned before, the points made in the documentary. I mean, if you were to just sit back and think about what's likely to come out tomorrow, you can almost predict what that narrative is going to be based on what we've seen in part one, which is essentially, I would imagine, CAA, lynchings, hate speech, etc., and the narrative that is likely to come out of that. So I'm not going to be one bit surprised. I'm not holding my breath at all as to what one might view tomorrow when part two releases. And so that's one part of it. So I already kind of know what that narrative is likely to be. But the other part is, of course, why should any government be worried about something like this when you can tell very evidently that there's clearly some sort of an agenda here. For what reason it's supposed to and what agenda it serves is not entirely clear to me. I don't think I'm qualified enough to comment on that. But censorship in itself, I think, just brings this entire saga, unneeded, unnecessary credibility and a whole lot of publicity, when I think, if it were just left to people to view and judge for themselves, you'd find that, they'll come to their own conclusions, and rightly so.
Okay, let me take last comments. I hope Sanjay is able to join us back to complete his point. First to you, Dilip, then I'll give Lord Karan Bilimodia the last word. There is a thing called, there's a principled argument and there's also a strategic argument. Let me ask you to wear your strategic hat. In the government sort of decision, which is a tough decision, it's like, we don't care, you guys can hand wring, you guys can criticize us, we've taken the decision. Do you think that there is going to be any sort of fallout for the government, or do you think this is a storm in a teacup? It's a non-issue in the end.
I think, like everything else in recent times, this will pass sooner than we realize it. There's two reasons. One is that you have Republic Day coming up in 2 days from now, and then that's followed very quickly by the budget. So as far as India is concerned, business as usual, we're going to go just romping ahead. And as far as the Prime Minister is concerned, yes, we have 5 trillion in sight. We have G20 presidency to worry about. And therefore, strategically, the government has sent out a strong message saying, we don't brook this kind of documentary. We will not pay attention to it. We've drawn some attention to it unwittingly. They recognize that, but that doesn't bother them.
Yeah. Karan, let me give you the last word. In your speech, you said, the UK has to actually realize that the world has changed. The world order has changed. Do you think that there is that understanding? Because I'll tell you, I was in Washington recently and I was asked some of these similar questions about India. And one of the things I said to my American friends was, look, I don't come here and talk only about abortions, shootings, and race, and what's happening and how you treat your African American community. I realize that there is more than a singular narrative. I ask for you to have more than a singular stereotypical narrative about my country. And I think that is what annoys a lot of Indians, irrespective of what their personal politics may be. Had the same documentary, I think, come from within India, it may have been dismissed, by supporters of the BJP, but it wouldn't have been able to be described as colonial or the white man's gaze or the Western stereotyping of India. So I just want to bring you in on that. How much of a lingering colonial gaze is there still of India?
So, for a start, let me just say that for a long time, I've been saying in Parliament and outside that the UK and the British government, the British Prime Minister, needs to apologize for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And that has not happened. I asked David Cameron to do it, he didn't do it. I've asked time and again, and they should make that apology. And when it comes to colonialism, please let's be clear. This is a program made by the BBC, not by the British government. The BBC is seen to be very independent in the way that it operates. And they need to answer for whether this program has shown a completely one-sided, biased view of matters that happened 20 years ago. It's said very, very clearly, time and again, the Supreme Court of India has given its judgment on this matter. As far as the UK is concerned, India, there is no colonial attitude at all, I can assure you. This is a perception. India actually is being admired by the UK. India is being looked up to by the UK. India should be a permanent member of the Security Council in the UN. It's wrong that it's not. The presidency's G20 is a perfect opportunity. And let me give you some good news. One of my roles is I am the co-chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on International Students. And I'm the Chancellor of the University of Birmingham, one of our biggest and best universities, top 100 in the world. Just last week, we got the news Indian students have overtaken the Chinese as the largest number of international students in the UK, almost 130,000 students. That is the wonderful news. That's the bridge that we got to build. The 1.6 million of people like me and like Prime Minister Rishi Sunak of Indian origin that are doing so well in the UK, that are respected within, and by, I hope, Indians who respect how well the diaspora are doing around the world. That's the future. Let's be positive about this.
Yeah, I think you make a great point, about sort of the rise of India and the rise of the India story. Sanjay, when we lost your connection, I actually said, I don't know if you heard me, that I promised I wasn't censoring you. So I think it's only fair that I allow you to quickly complete your point. Are you out of touch? Is there a misstep between you and the larger Indian sentiment about India, the self-image of India? Quickly, Sanjay, I've got to close.
Well, Barkha, let me tell you, a society is judged by the way it fights for those who actually need your support, the marginalized, the dispossessed, the minorities. And I believe today we are all caught up in this absolutely fake narrative of the so-called India story being crudely defined. And I'm a banker, but I will tell you, being crudely defined by a GDP and an FDI and an FTA. I believe ultimately it's about, are you able to give justice to your people? And you know something, I'll put it down in black and white terms. Gujarat still hasn't had a closure. I don't want to make it political, but there was an amicus curiae who was appointed by the Supreme Court who did not agree with the SIT and who said that there is prosecutable evidence that ought to be processed further. We can debate on and on, but the truth remains that over 1,000 people died. And we all know that the India that you and I live in, Barkha, today, sees a persecution of minorities on a daily basis. The Supreme Court of India, for the benefit of Mr. Belimoria and the other gentleman,
Bharat, yes.
Supreme Court of India has pulled up this government for religious polarization. The Supreme Court of India has pulled up this government for hate speech. The Supreme Court of India has pulled up this government
that this is the
on
same
many,
Supreme Court you just said doesn't work independently. So there's an
stance.
irony there, right, Sanjay? You are quoting the same Supreme Court criticism about an institution that you otherwise say doesn't work. Look, I was going to close, but I think I'll allow some brief rebuttals. I think Karan is wanting to come in.
The only thing I want to make is this. I come from the smallest minority community in the world. I'm a Zoroastrian Parsi. There are less than 100,000 of us, less than 60,000 in India. And I'm proud of being a Zoroastrian Parsi, but also being an Indian and a nation in Britain. So I'm very, very proud of that.
No, thank you for that. And I was going to say to Sanjay that both Bharat and Karan are not like, down the generation British Indian. I mean, they're from here. Karan was born here, family still here. Bharat has family still here. So these are not disconnected, deracinated British Indians. Dilip, if I want to just bring you in for a last word, I do have to close then. Dilip.
I think that, issues like this need to be closed quicker than later. It's important that the narratives be complete, but inevitably, history is always in the voice of the victor.
And therefore, who is chronicling that voice? I think that's where the debate is, right, Dilip, when it comes to this documentary. And who's the victim? Who's the perpetrator? These are all fiercely contested from 84 to 2002, from Jallianwala Bagh to, what happened in the emergency under Indira Gandhi. This carries on. These debates actually never close in the final way that Sanjay suggests they ought to.
The voice of the victims has partially been heard in the Supreme Court. It continues to echo elsewhere. But I think the voice of the government is very clear on this. There is the anxiety that this has been timed for a particular reason, and that's why they've come down so heavily on this. And that's the reason that we all need to look at it from that prism.
Okay, I will leave it there. The jury continues to be out. I think it is to the health of our democracy that we continue to be argumentative, sometimes in complete disagreement, sometimes in partial agreement, and long may it live and be that way. That said, I think that there is, one can be a very proud, passionate Indian, and there is no contradiction, Sanjay. I would just say that in the end, in calling out your government for what you disagree with, but believing very much, certainly I do, in the story and the future of my country. Thank you very much, Sanjay, Dilip, Lord Karan Billemoria, and Bharat Ramanan for joining us. And to our audience, thank you for watching. See you tomorrow. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Watch Her Story and support independent, robust journalism.